Once upon a time, London was the financial center of the world. The dominant currency of global trade was the British pound. 1 pound sterling was worth nearly $5. So how did the British pound lose this power when the British Empire collapsed? Did the world truly enter a new era? Think about the global order that dominates the modern world today. The dollar is the world's reserve currency and stands at the center of global trade. Almost all states are in debt. The task of funding markets lies with central banks. And what keeps the entire system alive is continuous new borrowing. If you think this order began with the United States, you're mistaken. America inherited this system and expanded it, but America did not invent it. This is the story of how Britain's debt empire transformed into a global order. Welcome to Code 404, Economy, the place where we decode the historical patterns of money and power. The truth is always hidden in the details. Let's go back to July 1944. While the conflicts of World War II were raging fiercely across Europe and the Pacific, on the other side of the world, 730 delegates from 44 countries gathered in a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal was to design an economic order that would rescue the world from the destructive consequences of war and promote global growth. After 3 weeks of negotiations, the world had been reshaped. The United States had replaced the British Empire. This did not happen through a ceremony or a declaration. It was a silent transfer of the flag. At the time, most people were probably not even aware of it, but the British Empire had quietly collapsed, and the American century had officially begun. This was not the result of a battle or military defeat. It was the decision of accounting ledgers. To understand how the dollar became the dominant currency, we must first understand the pound it replaced. In the 19th century, the British pound was the most trusted currency in the world, the undisputed king of the global order. This dominance began in 1821, when Britain pegged its currency to gold. This transformed the pound into more than just a piece of paper. It became a promise. You could take your banknotes to the Bank of England at any time and exchange them for gold. This commitment attracted merchants, bankers, and governments from all over the world. The pound was valued as highly as gold. In fact, because it was easier to transport, it was considered even better than gold. The pound became the currency of international trade. By 1914, more than half of global trade was financed in sterling. British banks had branches in nearly every major city in the world. London became the capital of finance. Nearly half of all foreign investments worldwide were managed from London. The pound was no longer just part of the system. It had become the system itself. Even as other economies grew, the pound remained the dominant currency, because confidence remained in Britain's commitment to honor its financial promises. By the late 1800s, the United States had already surpassed Britain in economic output. But thanks to the power of sterling, Britain maintained its global influence. In 1879, the US dollar was pegged to gold, signaling its credibility to the world. This move gave the dollar legitimacy, but a trusted, dominant currency already existed. In August 1914, World War I broke out. Believing that war costs could not be covered by taxes, Britain made an astonishing decision and suspended the gold standard. For the first time in nearly a century, sterling could no longer be exchanged for gold. This marked the beginning of the end for Britain. The gold backing sterling suddenly disappeared, and the currency devolved into a fiat money based solely on government promise. Worse still, Britain borrowed heavily from the United States. The world's largest creditor emerged from the war as a debtor nation. By 1925, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, made a decision that would alter the course of history, returning sterling to the gold standard at its pre-war parity. This was a matter of national pride for Britain. He wanted to restore the prestige of London and the pound. But this decision made sterling massively overvalued relative to its real economic value. Britain became expensive. Exports were strangled. Industry was paralyzed. Unemployment exploded. Economist John Maynard Keynes warned repeatedly about these consequences, but he was ignored. Following industrial devastation, mass unemployment, and exports grinding to a halt, Britain abandoned the gold standard again in 1931. As Britain struggled to heal its economic wounds, war returned once more. When World War II ended, Britain had won militarily, but was financially exhausted. Most overseas investments had been sold far below their real value, and massive debts had been accumulated across the world. When the war ended, the United States accounted for more than half of global industrial production. The majority of the world's gold reserves were under U.S. control. Britain, meanwhile, was deeply indebted to America. The world's new creditor was now the United States. By 1944, even before the war ended, the outcome was already clear. Britain would win the war, but it was financially depleted. There was no longer any possibility for sterling to remain the world's dominant currency. So what would replace it? This is precisely why 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods in July 1944. After 3 weeks, it was decided that the US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and all other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank would manage the system from Washington. Britain had no power left to resist. It was desperate. It owed enormous sums to the United States. And with the Bretton Woods Agreement signed on July 22, 1944, the dollar officially became the world's reserve currency. On the surface, this looked like a new system. But beneath it all, what was really happening was this. Britain's debt-based order was now being globalized through the dollar. Britain had used this system to manage an empire. America would use it to manage the entire world. The scale had expanded, but the logic remained the same. Now let's step back and look at the big picture. What had Britain done? We explained this in detail in our previous video. The British state had financed itself through debt. It turned bonds into safe assets and placed the central bank at the center of the system. Debt was not something to be eliminated, but something to be rolled over. So what did America do? The same thing. Yes, exactly the same thing. The only difference was that it applied it on a much larger scale. By 1971, America was experiencing something similar to what Britain had faced. Spending was excessive, gold reserves were insufficient, and the amount of dollars circulating worldwide had exploded, and Nixon signed the decision that severed the dollar's link to gold. Many believed this was the collapse of the system. But what actually happened was this. The debt system that Britain had constrained with gold now had no limits at all. This created an unprecedented and extraordinary power. The dollar's reserve status granted the United States an advantage that no empire in history had ever possessed. The world needed dollars to trade, and America could borrow endlessly in its own currency. When other countries borrow, there's always risk. Their currencies can depreciate, interest rates can spike, inflation can erupt. But America's situation was unique, because the money it borrowed was the very money the world was forced to hold. This is called exorbitant privilege, an excessive privilege. Having the reserve currency makes debt cheaper, which makes borrowing attractive. But as borrowing increases, spending grows. And as spending grows, production is pushed into the background. This cycle is the same one that once brought about Britain's downfall. America followed the same path due to its privilege. After the 1970s, U.S. industry began to shrink. Finance expanded, but its source was not production. It was debt. Production was replaced by debt-financed consumption. What we see in America today mirrors what Britain experienced roughly a century ago. Britain's collapse was not sudden. It unfolded slowly and silently. When we look at America today, we see enormous debt levels, chronic budget deficits, an oversized financial sector, and suppressed real incomes. We see disturbing similarities. Most importantly, debt is no longer an extraordinary tool used in emergencies. It has become the system's norm. At the same time, whispers of de-dollarization are growing worldwide. China and Russia are increasingly conducting trade in their own currencies. BRICS countries are discussing a shared reserve currency. Central banks are buying gold instead of US dollars. New payment networks are being built to replace the dollar-based SWIFT system. All of this echoes the early 20th century erosion of trust in sterling. The pound held reserve status for roughly 100 years. The dollar has held it for 80. So if the system is flawed, how does it survive? Because in this system, debt exists not to be repaid, but to be rolled over. U.S. Treasuries are collateral for banks, the safest reserves for central banks, and secure assets for pension funds. If the U.S. were to repay all its debt one day, the money in the system would vanish instantly. Liquidity would dry up, asset prices would collapse, and the economy would freeze. The most important legacy Britain left to the world was not colonies, borders, or military bases. It was a world order built on debt. America inherited this legacy, expanded it, and globalized it. But history shows us one thing clearly. Systems that grow through debt eventually drown in it, which means this. One day, sooner or later, a new Bretton Woods moment will arrive. At that point, the dollar, like the pound before it, may be forced to step down from the throne. This is not a prophecy. It is a warning. History has shown repeatedly that first finance rises, then debt explodes, and finally the order changes. Today, we are standing right in the middle of this cycle. And the real question we must ask is this. Will America repeat Britain's mistakes and meet the same fate? Or this time, will the story end differently? If this video gave you a new perspective, subscribe. The answers are hidden in history's codes. We reveal them.